Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Okay, so here we are once again in this special series that we're doing in honor of Elul about prayer, in which me, together with you guys, we're going to be trying to learn how to deepen our prayer and how to pray, how to best connect with God. This lecture series is based on a mimer, a tractate by the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe. And in learning this tractate, we're actually going to not only learn about how to pray, we're actually going to learn about the virtue of prayer itself. We're going to learn about why it's a good thing to try to cultivate and the great power that prayer can have. So a couple of introductory notes about today's episode. So first of all, one thing that I learned in researching this tractate a little bit is the reason for this mimer, the reason why the Rebbe Rashab actually said this mimer. And I'm getting this information from a shiur that I found on YouTube. And unfortunately, I could not find the name of the rabbi who gave over the shiur. So I apologize in advance for not giving credit where credit is due. If I do find out who said this shiur, who gave over this information, I'll try to put it in the show notes. But anyways, so what the rabbi said is that basically there are three known reasons why the Rebbe Rashab gave over this mimer. The first of which is that this was around the same time, soon after, rather, that he established the yeshiva of Tomchei Tmimim, the establishment of the first official Lubavitch yeshiva, and the boys that were studying at Tomchei Tmimim, people acknowledged that there was something special about these people, that there was something kind of different and unusual, and people wanted to know what this was. How could they be more like these Tmimim? They were known as. The word Tmimim could be translated, by the way, as pure kind of people or whole people. So, so there was a specialness of the students at the Tomchei Tmimim, and people wanted to emulate them. And one of the things that they were known for is the way that they prayed. The other factor that contributed to the Rebbe Rashab giving over this mimer is a different mimer that he had given over that's pretty famous. Some of you may have heard of it before, called Hechaltzu. It's known as the Avas Yisrael mimer. It's a mimer which really discusses loving your fellow Jew and everything. And one of the main themes of that mimer, which maybe we'll learn that mimer at a later date, who knows, is the idea of working on our character traits and refining our character traits, refining ourselves as people. And now, so what does that have to do with this particular mimer that we're studying here about prayer? Well, elsewhere in various Farbrengens, the Rebbe Rashab actually explains that the service of prayer, the Avodas Hatefilla as it's known, is actually the key to refining our character traits, to do this, to change ourselves as people. And in this way, this leads us to the third reason why the Rebbe Rashab gave over this mimer, which is that this prayer was a big topic at that time. It was a big question. A lot of Hasidim came to him asking about how to pray, and it was a theme that would come up in a lot of his Farbrengens very often. So these are the reasons why the Rebbe Rashab wrote this mimer, according to this class I found on YouTube anyways. Maybe there were some other reasons as well. But in any case, it's really useful for us. And even though it was written for a specific time and place, we'll see that the messages are really timeless and can very much apply to our lives nowadays. And hopefully we'll learn that, through this journey of learning how to pray, I think hopefully what I'm hoping to gain out of this is that we're actually going to get to a much deeper place where we're going to actually learn how to transform ourselves as people and connect to God in a way that we perhaps weren't even aware of was possible. Okay, now, last disclaimer before we get into the actual meat of today's episode, which is going to be where we're going to tackle chapter 1 of this mimer, is that actually in my research, one of the things that I found out is that a lot of people will actually begin learning this mimer at chapter 10 and then learn the whole mimer from chapter 10 till the end. There's 16 chapters, and then go back to the beginning and learn chapter 1. This reminds me a little bit of Shar HaYichud of the Mitzvah Rebbe, where it's a similar kind of thing. A lot of people begin starting Shar HaYichud of the Mitzvah Rebbe at chapter 10 as well, and it's actually for a very similar reason. And the reason for this is because chapters 1 to 10 in both this mimer and really the Shar HaYichud of the Mitzvah Rebbe as well, actually, talk about or are very instructional in terms of how to meditate and the virtue of meditation. Specifically, when we talk about meditation, we have a very specific definition to that. It's different than the idea of sitting on a hilltop and what you picture like in India and stuff like that. When we talk about Jewish meditation, specifically Chabad focused meditation, we're going to learn about what that means and what that involves. But there's a lot to say, and that's why the first 10 chapters actually deal with that and talk about how to meditate, the virtue of meditation, all of that. And then after chapter 10, chapter 11 and onwards, I believe, is when we actually get into the meditation itself, when we actually apply the tools that we learn in the first 10 chapters to actually praying, and it tells us in a more concrete kind of pragmatic way how to go about it. Here you go. Nevertheless, even though, it is recommended sometimes to start learning this from chapter 10, I don't know, I'm just very more linear like that, maybe a little bit. I'd rather start from the beginning and begin with chapter 1. I mean, this is after all how the Rebbe Rashab gave over this mimer. So I think there is something to say with that. And I think in learning it in this way, it might just require a little bit more patience on your part, on my part, in understanding that, yes, this is a podcast about prayer and how to pray better. And it might take a few episodes till we get to prayer, until we get to actually the meat and potatoes of praying and seeing practically how that works. So we're kind of going to be building the blocks originally for the tools for us to be able to get there. And that's what the first part is going to be. And so, just to kind of give you a general idea, I mentioned this in the previous episode in the introduction, kind of to give you a sense of what this is, what do these tools involve? It really involves the mind. And when we talk about meditation, we'll see that this type of meditation that we're talking about is specifically a very intellectual type of meditation. It's a type of meditation that involves honing the mind, channeling the mind in a very specific way, to ultimately really connect our minds with godliness in a very unique way. So today's episode is really going to just be kind of an introduction to this idea, introducing us to this concept of how it is that meditation can serve to connect us with God in a very, very deep and essential way, to the point where we actually can become one with God, and in a way that there's no more us, in fact. And we're going to talk about this type of meditation, this type of essential intellectual meditation of cleaving our minds to godliness. And we're going to contrast that with some other types of intellectual meditation or emotional forms of meditation, and which can also be useful, can also be productive. And we're going to kind of go through, different aspects of excitement and of pleasure that can be gained from these different forms of meditation. So today's episode is really going to be just kind of introducing this topic of intellectual meditation and what it can accomplish. And then in the next episode, in the following episode, we're going to actually discuss a little bit more what this meditation actually involves. What is it? If it's not sitting on a mountaintop and, breathing for 20 hours. What is it exactly? So let's get into it. So we're going to start the text. And like I mentioned in the previous episode, I am going to go through this like line by line, but I won't necessarily do it like word by word translation, but it's going to be more about like giving over these ideas. And I might pause here and there to give a little bit of commentary. So here we go. So the Rebbe Rashab begins saying that he's addressing this mimer to his beloved brothers and friends. So, kind of an endearing introduction. And he begins introducing this idea of what's known as Hisbonenut or Hisbonenus, depending on your accent. Now, this word is commonly translated to mean meditation, but to be more precise, it's kind of like an analytic study. Like the word Hisbonenut comes from the root of bina, which means understanding or analysis. So there's a practice that's common, that's spoken about throughout Chabad Hasidus of Hisbonenut, which basically, in very simple terms, it kind of means to study something, but like really in depth, like really to, spend time like focusing on it, like not to just learn something in a cursory way, but really to, sit there and learn something and think about something in like a more meditative way. Particularly within the school of Chabad Hasidus, this usually refers to meditating intellectually upon Hasidic ideas, which tend to be a little bit kind of more deeper and spiritual ideas and concepts that might at first glance appear to be a little bit more abstract. And the idea of Hisbonenus is to really, take these seemingly abstract ideas and to meditate and contemplate upon them until they become much more real and integrated. In this mimer, as I've mentioned, we're actually going to get into a lot more detail as to what we mean by this and, what to actually focus on as it relates to prayer. But here, the Rebbe Rashab brings up this idea of Hisbonenut in a more general sense. And he says that, amongst the Chassidim, it's kind of like a known thing, this idea of Hisbonenut, this practice of Hisbonenut. And then he gives some examples of Hisbonenut, of what people are mitbonen on, or what they meditate on. The first example that he gives is is when people meditate upon what's known as memale kol almin, which literally translates to mean fills all the worlds. This is a reference to the level of God's light, which fills all the world, which is contrasted with another level of God's light, another aspect of God's light, which is known as Sovev Kol Almin, which transcends all the worlds. These are two very common terms that come up in Chassidus a lot. We talk about them quite in depth in my Tanya podcast. So if you aren't following my Tanya podcast, you should go ahead and do that right now, to get better ideas of these concepts here. But here, just to give like kind of like a basic definition of this idea of a memale kol almin, the light that fills all the worlds. That's the light of God that is like within every single created being in a very specific way. So it's the way that God's light comes down into everything in a very particular way, and thus it involves a certain amount of limitation and constraint to it to be able to fill every particular thing in a very specific way. Now here, going back to the mimer that we're learning, the Rebbe Rashab says that this type of Hisbonenus on memale kol almin, on the light that fills all the worlds, is actually a type of Hisbonenus that can even be grasped by the natural mind and the animal soul. So it's by the human mind and animal soul. So he's sort of basically saying that this idea of practicing Hisbonenus, meditating upon this idea about how God fills all the world and God is present within all things, this is a very human thing that people can do. You don't even have to be a very spiritual person to be able to do this. This reminds me of, not to go too much on a tangent here, but this reminds me of another mimer of the Tzemach Tzedek, which I had learned a while back. And I hope that I am remembering correctly, but it talks about the mitzvah of believing in God. And, there's a whole discussion amongst the sages as to whether believing in God is a mitzvah or not. And it's not so clear. Some sages do include it amongst the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. Some do not. And the Tzemach Tzedek actually, that he reconciles this, and he says that the way that we reconcile this discrepancy and why it is that some people include it amongst mitzvahs and some people don't is because to believe that God exists is not a mitzvah. the mere existence of God, he says, is not a mitzvah because it's something that is, first of all, every single Jew, at least, really does believe this. It's an inheritance that was given to us from our forefathers. And secondly, it's something which any person with a human mind, if they're honest and they use their mind and their logic, they will arrive at this conclusion that God does indeed exist, and that, everything in the world, it contains godliness within it, and it is really ultimately sourced in God. So that itself is not a mitzvah to believe that. That's something which is obvious, basically, he says. But yet he says that what is the mitzvah? To believe in God, the mitzvah to believe in God, and where belief comes in, where there's sort of like a little bit of this leap of faith, we call it, that comes in, is in believing in God's transcendence. Believing that God is not just here in the natural order of creation, and that there's something kind of, a spirituality that exists amongst and a godliness that exists and permeates all of creation, but rather to believe that there's a godly force that actually transcends all of these things, that there's like a supernatural order, a purpose to it all. So that actually fits very well with the mimer in this sense where, going back to the mimer. So again, the Rebbe Rashab is giving some examples of the practice of Hisbonenus, the practice of intellectual meditation. And again, he says, one thing that people could meditate on is this idea of memala kol almin, the way that God fills all the worlds, that God's light fills all the worlds. And he says that this aspect of this type of meditation can actually be done by the animal soul and by the natural mind. You don't even have to be really in tune with your higher self necessarily, in order to do this, he's basically saying. But then he says that there's another type of, topic which a person could meditate on, and this is the subject matter of sovev kol almin, the light that transcends all the worlds. This is that light which we mentioned, that the Tzemach Tzedek spoke about, which does involve belief because it is a little bit more abstract. It's not necessarily just about the fact that God is here and present in all things, but it's about this light of God that actually transcends our reality and transcends all of these things. And the Rebbe Rashab goes on and he says that there's actually a level that's even higher than Sovev Kol Almin, than the light that transcends all the worlds. And he doesn't elaborate on what that is. In fact, there's a lot in Chassidus that talks about these levels and everything. But what he does say here is that even when we're talking about this light of Sovev Kol Almin, and which transcends all the worlds, and even when we're talking about the levels that are above Sovev Kol Almin, he says that even these things a person can come to understand if they actually put the time and energy into trying to understand these things. They could grasp these things with their intellect. Here he says it's not going to be grasped by the intellect of the animal soul, but rather the intellect of the godly soul, the Chabad of the godly soul, we say here, can actually grasp these things. And he says this is similar to when people practice this Hisbonenus, this meditation, on the first and second paragraphs of the Shema prayer. This again is a huge topic in Chassidus, and literally every sentence here could be elaborated upon, and we could do 10 podcast episodes on every single line. But it's I want to kind of keep it relatively brief so we can get to the core of what the Rebbe Rashab is getting to here. So really the point of what he's saying is that he's saying that there's many different subjects which one could apply this practice of meditation to intellectual meditation to, and in applying this intellectual meditation to these various topics, a person could actually grasp these topics. If we're talking about the level of God's light that fills all the worlds, that could actually even be grasped by a person's animal soul. And when we're talking about things that are a little bit higher, like Sovev Kol Almin, or the first two paragraphs of the Shema, or the levels that transcend Sovev Kol Almin, that could also be grasped, not by the animal soul necessarily, but they could be grasped by the godly soul. And then the Rebbe Rashab goes on to say that all the more so is this true when we talk about the different types of Hitbonenut, the different types of meditations that are specific to various specific character traits, specific midot, we call them in Hebrew. So certain meditations focus on arousing love, specifically love of God, and other meditations focus on arousing fear or awe, both of which are midos, it's the first two midos, the first two character traits that are within a human being. We have 7 basic emotive character traits. And so too, the third character trait. So we have Ava, we have Yira, which are connected actually to the midos of Chesed and Gvura. For those of you who have a little bit more of a background in Chassidus, then now the third midah is actually what's known as Tiferet, often translated as beauty. And the Rebbe Rashab says here that actually there are actually certain meditations that can allow a person to tap into and to arouse this trait of Tiferet, of beauty. What does that mean? That relates to this phrase in Aramaic, which I believe is taken from the Zohar. If I'm mistaken about this and somebody wants to correct me, please let me know. But I believe it's from the Zohar. It's in Aramaic. It's a very commonly cited phrase, which is said "L'istakla bi'ikara de malka," which is commonly translated to mean to gaze at the dearness or the preciousness of the king. So, when we think about beauty, we think about, we gaze at beauty. It's like we really appreciate beauty. We bask in beauty. We take it in. So those types of meditation, which arouse a person's tiferet, the way that this would manifest is that they'd have this sense of gazing at the dearness of God. So it wouldn't be so much about, arousing their love of God or their fear of God, so much as arousing their appreciation of God's beauty, of his preciousness. So just pause here. Actually, this is technically the end of the main body of this chapter, but what follows is a pretty big parentheses that elaborates pretty much on this last point of God's beauty and gazing at God's beauty, and this phrase of "Istakla bi'ikara de malka." So I'm going to continue on and I'm going to go through that parentheses because it's important, especially because it takes up so much, which really indicates to me that this is an important point that the Rebbe Rashab really wanted to bring across, to emphasize this gazing at God's beauty and kind of explaining the importance of this. But just to kind of recap what we've gained so far, again, from this main actual body of the text, is just, again, it's the Rebbe Rashab introducing us to this idea of Hisbonenus, introducing us to this idea of intellectual meditation and how different forms of intellectual meditation can cause different effects. They can either cause us to grasp an idea intellectually, whether it's with our animal soul or with our godly soul. And sometimes intellectual meditation can actually cause even an emotional response within us, whether it can either arouse us to love, for example, love of God, fear of God, or the final one, which he mentioned, is arouse our trait of tiferet, which is related to beauty, which manifests as gazing at the preciousness of the king. Okay, and now the Rebbe Rashab in the parentheses here, he says here that actually, even though we've been kind of making this, this final category of meditation, this idea of gazing at the preciousness of the king, we're putting that as its own separate category. But the truth is, he says, that every good and true meditation about any specific detail of God, whatever it is, especially when we're talking about the greatness of God or the loftiness of God or the wondrousness of God, all of these things actually have to do with gazing at the dearness of the king or the preciousness of the king. What does this mean? What do we mean exactly by this idea of gazing at the preciousness of the king? This is the idea of having our godly minds gaze at the preciousness and the virtue of the godly light and the preciousness of his great beauty and his loftiness, to the point that all of his senses become nullified in this gazing, to the point that he doesn't even feel himself at all. So lahavdil, if you can ever relate to this idea, if you've ever, seen a really beautiful painting, or let's say even watching a movie, or that you're really that you get lost in it, do you ever get that experience that you're looking at something really beautiful and you look at it and you're so captivated by the beauty of the thing or intrigued by whatever it is that you're watching, that you actually lose yourself in it. That's why people literally say, I lost myself in that painting and that, that experience, whatever it is. So here in this case, this is actually being applied to God, such that this type of meditation can actually lead a person to have this experience towards God, where they feel nullified towards God. And the Rebbe Rashab goes on to say that there's actually a great pleasure that comes from this gazing. And this is an aspect of pleasantness and sweetness and pleasure of the soul that delights in godliness. And the Rebbe Rashab here cites a verse from Yeshayahu, chapter 58, verse 14, where it says, Az hitaneg al Hashem v'irkavticha, which literally translates to mean like, and then you shall delight in God, and I, meaning God, will transport you. Okay, now the Rebbe Rashab goes on to say that just to talk a little bit about this pleasantness, this pleasure that we're talking about here, he says this is a very inner and essential pleasure, where one's entire being becomes nullified in this pleasure, to the point that there could be what's known as expiration of the soul, or kaluta nefesh, it's called in Hebrew, where a person could actually, like, God forbid, like, expire in this, like they don't have a sense of self anymore. We saw this back, during the time of when we originally received the Torah on Mount Sinai. There was this actually happened to the Jews when we heard the first two commandments. It was actually so intense, such an intense experience, that the Jews literally couldn't take it anymore, and they died. Their souls left their bodies, and they had to be revived again. And that's why they said, Moshe, can you please go and relay the messages to us? We don't want to hear it directly from God anymore, because they recognized that they couldn't be able to handle it anymore. It was too much. So this is a type of pleasure that is so intense and so essential and so inner that it really affects a person to the point where it's like they lose themselves so much that they literally could lose themselves for real in kaluta nefesh. And the Rebbe Rashab goes on and he says that this service is the idea of the essence of dvekus. Dvekus sichlo belokut. So what does that mean? The dvekus sichlo belokut. So dvekus is the idea of cleaving. A lot of other Hasidic groups, not Chabad, they often use this word dvekus. Dvekus, it means, cleaving. So here we're using that term too. And specifically, the Rebbe Rashab specifies that we're talking about the cleaving of one's mind in godliness. And he says that this is even higher than an excitement of the mind, an intellectual excitement. And definitely much, much higher than an emotional excitement that's found in the heart. Which he says, the main aspects of this kind of emotional excitement is the aspect of the inner aspect of Bina, etc. That's sort of like a side point, which could be a whole topic in itself. I'm gonna not elaborate on that so much, but just suffice it to say that there are many different levels of excitement that are elaborated upon in Chassidus, both into emotional excitement and intellectual excitement. But what he's saying here is that this type of experience that we're talking about, this type of like pleasure and delight that comes from this gazing at the preciousness of the king, remember that's the topic that we're talking about here, is a level of pleasure that transcends, that's higher than all of these types of excitements, whether intellectual excitement or emotional excitement. Nevertheless, even though it's higher than all of these things, that it still does permeate the heart. So, a person might think, since this is a type of excitement that originates in the mind, and the idea, as we'll see, Hisbonenus really does involve, it's a practice of the mind over and above all else. Nevertheless, it does permeate the heart also. And kind of like as a proof for this, or, something to support this idea, the Rebbe Rashab brings a verse from Kohelet, chapter 1, verse 16, where it says, "V'libi ra'a harbe chokhmah v'dat," which literally translates to mean, "And my heart saw much wisdom and knowledge." So, meaning to say, so the heart seeing wisdom and knowledge, it's kind of like equating the heart with the mind. So we're seeing that the heart and mind are not as separate as a person might think. And in fact, they're actually equal, says the Rebbe Rashab. And the Rebbe Rashab says that this is the idea of what's known as, the term for it is ta'alumot lev, which can be translated to mean the mysteries of the heart, or like the inner aspects of the heart. So what does that mean? That's where the godly light shines in the depth of one's mind and in one's heart. And now here's an interesting point that the Rebbe Rashab explains with all of this, is that he says that it's specifically because this light radiates in a revealed way in the inner recesses of a person's heart, there's actually no excitement. There's no movement in a revealed way. Because actually, like, the experience is a much more inner experience, where the heart is actually seeing and feeling the essence of God as it is above the intellect. And the light comes from the mind to the heart. So basically, in my understanding, what the Rebbe Rashab is saying here, that it's like, okay, what comes to mind for me is like, if you think about the difference between a person getting engaged versus a person getting married. And this is a huge generalization, but it's just like an example to give you guys like a little bit of a illustration of what this idea is. So if you think about, the last time you found out about a friend, or maybe you got engaged, and what was it like? A lot of times you find out a girl gets engaged and everybody's like, oh my gosh, and they're like screaming and yelling, and like the girl's screaming, and it's so exciting, and it's like really like, a lot of noise, a lot of movements, people are jumping up and down and singing and dancing and all that stuff. Versus then it comes to the wedding, and yes, at the wedding there's singing and dancing and all that stuff too, but when you think about like the chuppah, which is like where the actual marriage happens, it's actually a much more still process. It's a much quieter process, because there it's not that like, we're no longer excited, we're no longer happy, God forbid. It's that the happiness has permeated a lot deeper. Like now it's not just like external things, like the engagement period is sort of like this more external experience. But then when it comes to marriage, there's this like real essential connection going on, this really essential union happening. So it's a much deeper thing. And that's basically my understanding of what the Rebbe Rashab is saying here, is he's saying that this connection that we're talking about here, of where a person's mind cleaves to God and to the godly light, this is such a deep and essential type of connection that it actually doesn't involve a lot of movement, and it doesn't actually manifest as this like exciting thing, at least not externally. Even though it's not that it's cold, it does permeate the heart. It's just in a much more essential and deeper way. And so now the thing is, while, the usual course of events is that this deep light that's manifest within the heart does travel through the mind first, which is why we have this idea of Hisbonenus, this intellectual meditation. He does say in another parenthesis here that there is another way for this light to radiate within the inner parts of the heart, without the mind, where there's no understanding at all, and in this case, this is a type of radiance and arousal that is totally out of bounds, like totally unlimited. It's much more like unlimited type of radiance, and within this are different levels as well. As is written, talking about the difference between ratzo de tikkun and the ratzo in the aspect of tohu, etc. So again, just little technical terms here. Again, I don't think it's important to elaborate all that much, but the basic idea is that within Chassidus, we have this concept of ratzo, which is contrasted with shov. So ratzo means running, shov means returning. So these are kind of like two movements that are described in terms of how we connect with God. Ratzo is where we kind of like are moving upwards towards God, in almost like a flying way, like kind of like going outside of our body and the physical world. And shov is becoming more grounded, where we actually bring this energy back down here into our world. We talk about the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and the whole story, where they went in drunk to offer sacrifices in the temple. And, there's a lot of chassidus and commentary that talks about that. But the basic idea of what their sin ultimately was is that they had ratzo without shov. They were like flying without returning. Even the drunkenness may have been physical drunkenness with wine, or it may just have been like a spiritual kind of drunkenness, but whatever it was like they were just like kind of high and they weren't coming down. But not to say that this is a negative thing. Ratzo is a very necessary and good thing if it's balanced, if it's done in the right context. And so the Rebbe Rashab here is just describing that even within this aspect of ratzo, this practice of ratzo, there are actually different levels within it. There's ratzo of tikkun, which is more, it's the ratzo of rectification, which is a little bit more limited and contained. And then there's the ratzo of tohu, which is uncontained. The ratzo, it's chaotic. Tohu is chaos. So this is all just like a little side note, actually, just describing about how one might have that experience of having this inner light within one's heart become manifest, bypassing the mind. But then the Rebbe Rashab goes back to this aspect of the innerness of the mind, this meditation of the mind, which he says, since even though we're talking about the mind here, but we're talking about a level of the mind that actually transcends understanding, at least external understanding, and thus it actually does not have any movement or any kind of arousal to it at all. But on the contrary, it's like there's a nullification that happens where a person becomes like a stone, like an inanimate stone. Like, again, think about like an experience that you, or maybe you've seen someone have this kind of experience where it's like they're so overwhelmed by what's happening that they don't even react. It's like it's beyond reaction. It's just like they're just like taking it in like a full way where they become like nullified to what's happening. So this is all just a kind of a tangent to explain that while we're talking about all these different forms of meditation, and the final form that the Rebbe Rashab gave us was this idea of meditation on the gazing at the pleasantness of the king. This is all to say that the Rebbe Rashab is saying that really this aspect of gazing at the pleasantness of the king can be present in any aspect of meditation, any topic that one meditates upon in terms of godly ideas. However, how to move in the opposite direction, the Rebbe Rashab here now concludes this thought, this chapter, with saying that there is actually a specific type of meditation that is specifically associated with the midah of Tiferet, the attribute of beauty. And he says, as an example, there's the idea of the inter-inclusion of two opposites, such that two opposite things can become combined into one topic. Which, when this happens, this is where the greatness of God's beauty is manifest amongst the creations of all the worlds, of the Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, the three main created worlds, which contain within them the inter-inclusion and the unification of these opposites. So just to explain this a little bit, so this is actually, again, spoken about in Tanya. I talk about this in my Tanya podcast, but what is beauty? Beauty is about the combination of opposites. It's where there's, two opposing forces, and then there's a harmonious union that happens. So if you have just like, one color, that's not going to be beautiful. If it's just like one color, one shape, what makes beauty is when you have some type of tension, conflict, and then there's resolution. Think about, a movie or a book, a novel or whatever. What makes the story interesting is when there's tension, when there's conflict, and then there's a resolution. So too, in a piece of art, and, anything, and ideas, intellectual beauty is when you have, thesis, antithesis, and then you have a synthesis. The synthesis, the beauty, is where you combine these two opposing ideas, where you take two ideas, like let's say you have two people who are fighting, one person has one opinion, another person has another opinion, and then you bring in a mediator, and a beautiful mediator will be able to find a reconciliation that combines these two ideas so that everybody is happy. It's not such a simple thing, but if they're able to do that, that brings out the beauty of the ideas. And so this is this idea of the harmony in finding inter-inclusion and unification amongst the opposites. This is all based in this attribute of Tiferet, of beauty. And this is where it comes from. And this force is underlying our entire reality. And it's there in, the Rebbe Rashab says, within all of the created worlds. And then the Rebbe Rashab goes on to say that it's actually also present not only in these lower created worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, which are the three lower worlds, but actually it's found within the higher worlds as well, and even in the worlds of the Ein Sof. The Rebbe Rashab says, so really all the worlds all the way up, this attribute of beauty is found there, to the point that truly we could say that the completion of God's essence is that he is carrying, like he is bearing all of the opposites in all the worlds. Like God, when we think about God, when we think about God's oneness, here he uses the term yachid, singularity, uniqueness could be another way to translate that. That it is really God's uniqueness, is that God contains within him all opposites. It's an interesting way to think about God, you know? And then in the concluding line here is that in gazing at this, then a person will come to this gladness of the heart. Well, they'll become very, very happy in this beauty of God, in the Tiferet Hashem, and in the splendor of his pride is the term used here, Hadar Geono. So that's the end of chapter 1. And just final note here is that very nice thing that I really appreciate. I like this format a lot, is the Rebbe Rashab actually provides a little summary at the end of every single chapter, just like a one-line summary. I love that. It's so my style. So I'm going to give you guys that summary here so that we can kind of say, okay, this is the takeaway. If you take nothing else away from this chapter, this is what you need to know. So the Rebbe Rashab says, what is the summary of this chapter? Is that this chapter talks about the virtue of Hisbonenus in a general sense, of intellectual meditation in a general sense. And in specific, talking about the meditation upon God's greatness and loftiness. What do we mean by this? By this idea of istakla beikara de malka, gazing at the preciousness of the king, which is the essence of the cleaving of one's mind in godliness. So that's the basic idea. So that's it for chapter 1. So again, today we talked about this idea of meditation, intellectual meditation upon God, really focusing on meditating upon the beauty of God, the preciousness of God, and talking about, what that means, this idea of encompassing all opposites and everything. And then in the next episode, we're going to take this a step further, and we're going to actually begin talking about what we mean by meditation. So very nice. Now we know that there's a great virtue to meditation, how important it is and what it can accomplish and everything. But what does this actually mean? How can we define this type of meditation? So stay tuned for that. And I look forward to speaking to you in the next episode. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.